Hey guys, how y'all doing? BionicleSaurus here, and this is the Carnegie Collection Dimetrodon. And it is 17 years old. It came out the year I was born. And in this video, we're going to be taking a look at its much more recently released successor, the Safari Ltd 2018 Dimetrodon. Let's talk colors. The colors on this figure are pretty simple, but gosh darn, I love them. Okay, first of all, the overall counter shading on the body, the actual color scheme of like basically most of the figure. And you have this gray going into this kind of reddish brown burnt umber kind of color on the bottom, which actually has some nice kind of staining or perhaps dry brushing of a slightly darker kind of color in there to make it look a little less monotone. That's a really nice subtlety. And in general, I really like the fact that they went for counter shading, but not standard counter shading. Because what's the obvious thing to do with dark on top and light on bottom? You have brown on top, and then tan or cream or even straight white on the bottom. But they didn't do that here. They went for, rather than a brightness contrast of dark to light, I mean the top is darker than the bottom, but the more important contrast visually is actually a color temperature contrast. Seriously, look at the gray. It's 100% a cool color. It actually has a decent amount of kind of blue and green in it, but then in sharp color contrast, the bottom is extremely warm. It's completely a warm sort of orange or red based looking color. And that contrast between different color temperatures is like not something that is utilized all that often on dinosaur figures, but it just works so well. Another thing I love is how subtle these stripes on the sail are. They could have easily covered the sail in incredibly bright coloration. They could have made these red stripes really pop out. But I'm glad they didn't, because if they had, they might have ended up looking a little toy-like, a little fake, or just too bright and a bit off-putting. As it is, I think this just looks fantastic. It gives you just a little hint of interesting patterns and colors, a little bit of a hint at this maybe being a display feature, at least speculatively, but it's nothing that's overbearing on a visual level. It looks really good. When it comes to the paint application of things like eyes, nostrils, teeth, all those little details, it's super well done. Like seriously, even on some of the best figures you can occasionally find little bits of white and pink, you know, from the teeth and gums sort of bleeding onto each other. But look how well those teeth are painted. They're well sculpted, which definitely helps. And we see well sculpted teeth on a lot of Safari figures, but like the paint is just exceptionally well done for this mouth and all the dentition. The eyes are pretty well painted, although I feel like the black needs a little more coverage. On the edges of the eyeball, you can see a little bit of the gray of the head coming through. Pretty minor though. I like the way the nostrils look, that's for sure. A little bit of a gloss in there. They're a total just dark black, but something about that works. In terms of the sculpt, like the detail, and well, not even just the detail, just the sculpt in general, since we haven't talked about it too much, it's fantastic. There's nothing super exceptional to talk about, but it's right up there with your average Safari quality standards. And you know, when I say average, that's a relative term, because for Safari these days their average quality is better than most. So what I'm really saying is the quality of the sculpting is fantastic on this figure, in case you couldn't tell for yourself just by looking at it. I love the pose. It's nothing fancy, but I do like the way this arm here is striding forward, a little bit lifted off the ground. At least a couple of the digits are. Reminds me of the type of walk that a monitor lizard has, where the arms kind of sway out a little bit as it moves forward. And that sort of look is amplified by the slight curvature of the sail, showing that that backbone is kind of undulating as he walks. The head sculpt looks good. The scalation is crisp as always. Yeah, in terms of just general aesthetics, this figure just looks great. It's as simple as that. In terms of anatomy, I do have one little complaint, but I also have a whole host of compliments, so we'll just get the negative out of the way now. I do think that the limbs and extremities are a little big. The limbs are quite long, quite muscular. They're not super far off, but I think they could be downsized a little. There's something about the proportions there that isn't quite hitting the nail on the head. The bigger problem, though, for me are the hands and feet, the outermost extremities. They just look kind of big and goofy, especially the front feet. I understand there's a lot of fingers in here, so it's honestly probably pretty difficult to sculpt it at a smaller size, but if there was a way to just downsize the extremities, make the hands and feet more compact, I think that would improve the overall anatomy of this figure. Having said that, I do definitely prefer this to the old Carnegie version, which, as you can see, has these tiny spindly little limbs that barely even look like they could allow it to propel its own weight forward. I mean, this thing doesn't look like it can even walk. Look at its tiny little legs. On the other hand, this one just goes a little too far in the other direction, but I would still strongly prefer this one. I think it's a lot closer to the real thing. Now, in terms of positives when it comes to anatomy and accuracy, oh my goodness, I have a load of them. Now, Dimetrodon in itself as a genus is like a complex scientific topic at the moment. There's so much to talk about. So why don't we just start with, I don't know, integument. There we go, integument. We'll start with that. So they went with scales. I think scales are fine. They could have gone smooth skin, maybe even hair, but you know what? That's pretty speculative at this point. They could have been more mammalian than we might expect, as they are closer related to mammals than pretty much most, if not all, other reptiles around, but as it is, scalation is fine, because these are a very, very old type of animal, some of the earliest reptiles that we can even really consider mammal-like. So having a slightly older integument, or a more ancestral integument, is perfectly acceptable. I think this is totally within the realm of probability. And I also like how the scales aren't super crocodilian or lizard-like. They're very smooth, very uniform in size, showing perhaps an early trend to smoother skin. And that's kind of a cool little subtle touch. In terms of the overall proportions, while I do think the limbs are a tad on the big, bulky side, I love the way the torso looks. Visually, I think the proportions are fine. The head is the right size, the sail is the right height. That's an important thing to get correct, and they have. And I like how the tail is kind of a thin little spindly thing. Seriously, this whole guy is like super muscular. Like, this is an incredibly powerful looking animal with kind of a little doinky tail. And that's fantastic because that is very much a mammalian-looking trait. Mammals, generally, while their tails can be strong, have very thin-looking tails in comparison to the rest of their bodies. So it's great to see that type of feature included on the anatomy. It's also great that they have taken the latest research into account and shown that the vertebral spines stick up just a little bit out the top of the sail. We know from sort of inconsistent bone textures on the neural spines of Dimetrodon that at least the tips of them would have been exposed, so that's fantastic that they worked that in as well. Right number of fingers, dentition looks good, the overall skull shape is right on the nuggets in terms of actual Dimetrodon skulls, and one thing I love is the maxillary notch is kind of underdefined, but you can totally see it's there. If you look in the roof of the mouth, that iconic sort of snaggletooth look is 100% properly restored. It's just a little bit more subtle because of the lips, and I love that this thing has lips, and in general, quite a thick layer of facial muscle and flesh and tissue and scalation. It's not shrink-wrapped in the least, and if you look at mammals, they have the most soft tissue stuff going on their heads and faces of basically any group of animals. So that is a very important thing to get right, and they did. I think it looks fantastic. I find it interesting that the cloaca is not a sort of vertical slit going this direction along the body. It's actually more of a horizontal little sort of half-moon type shape or half-circle line, which is more of a traditionally reptilian cloaca. Again, I think this figure is fantastically accurate, and I really like this particular anatomical take on Dimetrodon, not because it's super reptilian, not because it's super mammalian, but because it's a fantastic mix of both. In terms of size, there's nothing too weird to comment on. I'll put up a shot here of it next to some other safari figures to give you an idea of how big it really is. It's about the perfect size to where it's big enough that you can get a nice amount of detail packed in there, but it's not so big that it just looks ridiculous. It's still probably a little too big, a little out of scale for most dinosaur figures. It's definitely bigger than 140, but It's about the same as the old Carnegie one. Overall, I'd say this is about the size that I would expect and about the one I would want. So, my final rating for the 2018 Safari LTD Dimetrodon is a 9 out of 10. This thing is just fantastic. It looks great, it's sculpted well, it's the most accurate Dimetrodon on the market by and large. I really love it. It kind of underwhelmed me at first when I saw the pictures, I have to be honest. I never thought it was bad, I thought it was objectively great. It just wasn't one of those figures that jumped out at me, but having it in hand, I wish I would have gotten it sooner. I really love this little thing. If you would like to purchase this fantastic Dimetrodon or any of Safari Ltd's products, you can do so at their website, www.safariltd.com. You can also save 10% on any purchase from said website using the discount code BIONIC. And you can, of course, find all of their products on their Amazon store, amazon.com/SafariLTD as well. Thank you for watching, and BionicleSaurus signing out.